Hello economics students, we're now in week 2 and this week we have chapters 5, 6, and 7. You also have your first pricing paper due, so make sure to look at the syllabus. Again, what you want to do is pick out a company that you want to research. This is going to be the same company you're going to use for week 2, 4, and 6 for the papers. These are all individual papers. Like I looked at the 7 to 8 pages. But that works cited page could be a page considered page 2. So, but definitely utilize resources, use attributive tags, references. Look at the writing rubric for that paper. Again, we'll have a forum discussion too. So I'll put one out there dealing with elasticity and demand question. And then again, the homework problems. So if you have any questions on the homework problems, do email me and ask me. And I put an example out there too to help you understand consumer, producer, surplus, kind of a little geometry view, basically an area of a triangle. So it's area is base times height times 1/2, or 1/2 times base times height. So that will help you a little bit in your understanding of the homework problems. And then also for this week, we look at chapter 5, it's kind of a continuation of supply and demand analysis. Kind of the situation, is that if something happens, which way does the supply or demand curve shift? And in our discussion last week on marijuana, I kind of asked you, hey, what are your thoughts on which way this demand curve and supply curve would shift if marijuana was legalized? And with this, it also, this chapter looks at discussions of government intervention in markets. There can be examples of price ceiling or price floor. Good example of price floor is minimum wage. It says that you cannot pay below a certain wage. And I believe at the federal level that's at $7.25, but some states have it as high as close to $10, maybe if you're out in Washington somewhere. So in a market with wages, as long as the equilibrium is above the price floor, there's really no issue. But the problem occurs is with, say, somewhere that they set a floor that you have to pay $12 an hour and the actual market or equilibrium wage is $8. So that's a binding price floor. It doesn't allow the market to get to equilibrium. So although the government has had good intentions to try to help people out by giving them a higher wage, it actually creates a higher level of unemployment, because at $12 an hour, you're going to have only so many fast food restaurants that want to hire workers. But a lot more people want to work at $12 an hour, so you actually create unemployment in the market. Other example of price floor price ceiling would be, you think about ceiling, you can't charge above that price. These are examples of like rent controls. State of Hawaii tried this with gasoline a few years ago, and it was a disaster. But if in a market, if the say for a one-bedroom apartment in New York, the average price is $2,000. And the government steps in and says you can't charge more than $1,500. Well, what happens is you're going to have a lot more people that want apartments at $1,500 and a lot less people willing to supply at $1,500, who actually create a shortage in the market. So for the most part, when the government does try to step into markets in these situations, it actually kind of makes the market worse off, although they have good intentions. So economists argue that markets are supposed to be efficient, but not necessarily equitable. We tend to like the prices and outcome to be established in the market, and people can make their choices about what they want to consume. With chapter 6, you start to get into elasticity of demand. With this, you think of something that's very inelastic. It means that we are going to pay the price no matter what happens to the price. Gasoline is a good example. I noticed gas over the weekend here locally went from like $3.08 to $3.20 overnight. And it was like, what happened? Well, but if it goes up to $4 tomorrow, we're still going to buy it. In the short run, our demand is very inelastic. Elastic means that we're very responsive to something and change in price. So even small changes in price, we'll find a substitute. And generally with elasticity demand, the more substitutes there are available, the more inelastic the good is. The less the amount of substitutes available, the more inelastic. And as managers, we have to kind of decide, is our good elastic or inelastic? Should I raise the price or decrease the price? And bottom line, what's going to happen to my total revenues and what's going to happen to my profitability? Because ultimately you want to try to maximize those revenues, maintain your cost, and that difference between your cost and your revenues is going to be your profit. Okay, and with this chapter too, you look at different degrees of elasticity. You'll see like if demand curve is vertical, that's like perfectly inelastic. But if you have a very flat demand curve, it's more very elastic in demand. And that same things can go true with supply. You know, it can be very inelastic supply, or it can be the elastic supply. And this chapter also talks about price discrimination. That's probably what I'll do with the forum discussion a bit too. But price discrimination is charging different prices to different consumers for the same product or service. And this happens in different markets. If you go to McDonald's, it's not going to exactly happen. You go to the McDonald's kid at the counter, and he doesn't size you up and say $6. Okay, well, no. They have a flat menu price, so it's $3 for the Big Mac. But in different situations, like buying a car or an airplane seat, or even if you have a coupon as an example of price discrimination. And by price discrimination, you have to have two things that exist. One is that you have to segment markets. So perhaps I give you a discount if you're a senior citizen, and it has to have the inability to engage in arbitrage. That is that if I give the coffee discount to the senior citizen, they can't go back outside and resell it to the market at a higher price. Our last chapter, chapter 7, look at that. We're going to look at consumer and producer surplus. This is kind of the idea in theory that if, going back to the previous example about elasticity or price discrimination, most of the time we buy a good or service, it's at that same price. We might have been willing to pay $15 for HBO, but if we got it for $10, you actually have $5 in consumer surplus. So it's the difference between what you're willing to pay and what you actually had to pay. And if I'm a smart business owner, if I can identify consumer surplus, I could actually charge each person the most that they're willing to pay, and that's kind of idea of price discrimination. Same thing with producer surplus. There's some people who are willing to enter the market as the price goes up. Maybe you would be willing to paint my house for $3,000, and if I offered you $5,000, you'd actually have $2,000 of producer surplus. So thinking of consumer surplus as the area below the demand curve but above price, and producer surplus is the area above the supply curve but below the price. And a lot of this chapter the rest of it looks at what happens if a tax is implemented. As you'll go through the readings this week, the amount of the tax they show is kind of a shift up of that curve by the amount of the tax, and as a result, a new price equilibrium in the market. So the government does gain some revenue, but depending on the elasticities of these supply and demand curves, it's kind of a question of who bears the burden of that tax. And for an example, like cigarettes, the demand is typically highly inelastic, so it's very steep. So any taxes placed on cigarettes, it's usually those that smoke have to bear the majority of that tax. So, well, I really enjoyed the discussion last week. Looking forward to more continued great discussion in the forum discussions. So, again, if you do have any questions, send me an email. But otherwise, have a great week.